So what are the most interesting questions one can expect in job interviews in 2024? And I prepared the list with my top 10. And next, I'm going to go through these in reverse order. That is from the list to the most commonly asked, and give you a few hints and some examples on what's the best way to answer these. Right? On number 10, we have what's your view on diversity, equality, and inclusion? Right? So this is a relatively new interview question on a trending topic, not just for job interviews, but also in employee development in general. And one of the best ways to answer it would be to link such initiatives with business outcomes, right? So business outcomes means different things to different roles. But if you think of examples where diversity, equality, and inclusion produced some results, some interesting results, I believe that's the best possible way to answer such questions, right? Number 9 here. Tell me about a complex decision you had to make, right? So decision making, it's a well-known topic in job interviews. What you should know about this decision could be a decision could be determined by many factors. For example, cutting through ambiguity could highlight your ability. Your decision making, or making a tough prioritization, could also highlight in your decision making. Or for more senior manager level roles, delegation could be a super efficient way to highlight again your decision making. So number 9, a complex decision. Next one, number 8. Tell me about a time when you influenced someone cross-functionally. Right, so about cross-functional teams. Again, a relatively new question in job interviews. I'm comparing this to, questions such as what's your weakness, when saying it's relatively new, because cross-functional teams are nothing new actually. And I found for most candidates, the key is to understand what's a cross-functional team and what's the opposite of a cross-functional team. That is a functional one, right? So when you have a team of 5 developers, that's a functional team. When you have a team of developers, marketing, salespeople, then that's a cross-functional team, right? So if you have a broad range of roles in that team, then that's a cross-functional team. And if you put it this way, regardless of your role and regardless of the seniority of your role, you'll be able to come up with an example for this, right? So the key is understanding what's a cross-functional team, and then putting yourself or remembering what's your best story to use for these things. Also, probably useful to know is reason why they're asking you this, because they want to screen you on your interpersonal skills as well, right? So maybe it was a time when you influenced someone, it's a time when you had a conflict with someone, but it's on the category of interpersonal skills. This is also quite relevant, right? Number 7, most interesting interview question you should prepare for in 2024 would be, do you have any questions for me? Okay, so this question actually gets asked in pretty much any interview. It's a standard interview question. And I find that there is more and more value on having an efficient approach to answer it. And I believe there are 2 areas to think about when questions for them. First is what you prepare before the interview, right? Ideally, some tailor-made questions specifically for your interviewer. And then there's how your interview evolves. So how your interview evolves could also trigger some super interesting questions for them. Then maybe also interesting for you to consider here would be that some people prefer to ask simple follow-up questions. When did you join the company? Do you like working here? And stuff like that. While other candidates try to find more peculiar types of questions. So it's very much of a matter of preference, and of course the dynamic of that interview. If you notice, for example, the interviewer doesn't have a lot of skin in the game here in the decision making, then maybe it's not worth getting them stuck with a question for them, right? So, but again, questions for them, I believe it's an efficient way to prepare for a job interview. Number 6 here, what's your worst failure? Okay, so failure stories. Failure questions, I should say, have been quite common in job interviews with companies which put an emphasis in behavioral interviews. This has been for a long time. Now more and more companies are putting a lot of emphasis in behavioral interviews, and as their interviewers learn more about what's the most efficient type of question to ask candidates to screen them behaviorally, then failure questions also come into place, right? What you should know about failure stories, if you try to answer it right now without having a story prepared, you'll have a bit of difficulty remembering or finding what's the best way to sell yourself for the purpose of a job interview. The worst thing you could do about a failure story would be to talk about how you got fired from your last role last week because you underperformed, right? Because the definition of behavioral interview is that you screen someone on their past behaviors so you can predict their future performance on the job. Whereas if you got fired last week from your job because you underperformed, then you're likely to underperform in your future job as well, right? So this is the mistake. Not many people do it, but still there is this thing. Then the other mistake people do answering failure questions is because there's a lot of brain cycles you use to think about, hey, what's the best story and how to present that, you completely forget to talk about one of the most interesting parts of it, that is your learnings from that failure story. And learnings are also something which take a little bit of time to acknowledge, especially in huge failures. When you have failed business, it's difficult to acknowledge exactly as to why it failed. But needless to say, people usually have 3 attempts to prepare a failure story until they find something they're actually confident using for the purpose of a job interview. Number 5 here, a pretty common one. What's your weakness? Okay, so public speaking. So that's the reflex that many of you have. It won't get you disqualified from a job, but if you want to make a difference in a job interview with a high-performing company, then you should probably go beyond public speaking or cliches such as I work too much, I pay too much attention to detail and stuff like that. So weaknesses, the best way to sell yourself with a weakness would be with a story. Okay, and of course, maybe link it a bit with some learnings, with something interesting. Actually, I don't find that this is a hard interview question to the extent you prepare for it in advance a little bit, right? Next one, number 4 here. Tell me about the time I had a conflict with a colleague or with your boss if you want. All right, so interpersonal skills as well. When if you remember the cross-functional ones and the diversity, equality, and inclusion goals as well. So interpersonal questions around interpersonal, time when you had a conflict with someone, they wouldn't be so popular unless they worked, right, to screen candidates. And what happens here is that some of you don't have the best possible answers for this, or you don't feel comfortable talking about a time when you had a conflict with a colleague or with your boss. And then you start cloning someone else's answer because it sounds good, and you think, hey, yes, I could refit my experience into that. Where many of you don't realize is that for someone who does this full time, does this every day to screen candidates, or even me as talking to candidates all day, it's easier than you think to spot when someone is not really sincere about these things. There are many ways to discover this, but let's keep it simple for now. So long story short, how do you go about answering a time you had a conflict with a colleague? You go with a real life example and don't blame them. Don't blame your boss. Don't blame the other company. Don't blame your coworkers. Don't blame anyone. Try to stay away from this and you'll basically be fine. Keep in mind, it cannot be perfect. When you have a conflict, it cannot be perfect, right? That's the beauty of the answer if you want. But be yourself, because I found sells best in the case of these interpersonal skills. Now, of course, you could. There are many other ways to bias the interviewer towards you and so on and so forth. But on interpersonal, I'd recommend you stay as simple as possible. So again, no need to differentiate yourself necessarily, but don't get yourself disqualified either. Number 3 here, most commonly asked question in job interviews for 2024 would be, tell me about one of your projects. Okay, so it's a super simple interview question, and the reason number 1 interviewers will ask you such a question is to see if you prepared for the job interview in the first place, right? Because what happens here is that even if you only prepare 3 stories for that job interview, if the interviewer chooses to make a deep dive on one of those 3 stories, most of you will actually fail to remember some details, some key elements from it. So it become obvious, hey, how this candidate performs. Another reason why someone would ask you this and why it's become so common, because what happens here is that more and more companies are adopting behavioral interviews, right? Without calling them a behavioral interview. right? So when I ask you tell me about one of your project, the translation to this would be, what's your best story, right? And then you go with the deep dive. You can go in many directions, behaviorally speaking, but also technically, ultimately, if you want. So it could be the starting point of any possible conversation, right? So this is again, even if it's not tell me about the time when you had an interesting project, one of your projects could be interpreted as a behavioral question, and that's usually the use case you should think about, right? And of course, you'd want to talk about the highlight, because everyone wants to talk about their key highlights from their career, because you want to sell yourself on your strength for the purpose of a job interview, right? But one of your projects would be the third most commonly asked. The second most commonly asked would be, why do you want to work here for this company, right? And the reason why these questions are so commonly asked, when they could ask you many other questions as introductory questions for the purpose of job interviews, because the vast majority of you will have some cliche answers of only complimenting the company that you're applying for. And when for someone doing this full time, when you're over complimenting them, it shows, right? So there's not much value you bring to the table as a candidate if you tell me, hey, this is an amazing opportunity, an amazing company, amazing people, and so on and so forth, right? So what you should do instead here is to think a little bit maybe what's in for you, right? To be a bit more cautiously optimistic with these questions. Eventually try to answer a question, genuinely trying to answer a question, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Right? But a more realistic approach, right? So I understand you compliment them in one sentence or two, but the rest of your answer should, highlight on something that you're a qualified candidate. You're not just overwhelmed by the opportunity, right? And the number one question in job interviews in 2024 will still be your elevator pitch. You tell me about yourself. And what's different these months or this year from previous years is now we have ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is amazing at giving you some elevator pitches, which are great motivational pitches if you want, right? So it's super efficient. I'd recommend you to take a look for your role, for the job that you're applying for. I think it's a great exercise, right? However, it still remains one of the more commonly asked interview questions. And in my opinion, your goal, if you want to do well, if you want to significantly increase your chances to pass interviews with high-performing companies, you should differentiate yourself from other candidates. Now, how do you differentiate yourself from other candidates with your elevator pitch? Well, if everyone wants to wow the interviewer, you could consider a boring answer to that elevator pitch, a straightforward one, a 15-second or a 20-second one with the key highlights from your career, and then say, yes, would you like me to develop more on any of these? Actually made recently a video on maybe a boring answer to tell me about yourself would be more efficient for you to differentiate yourself from other candidates and make a better impression overall in the job interview. So long story short, I believe that again, your elevator pitch could be a great way to differentiate yourself to the extent you realize that the trend is to over perfection and to over invest time into such initiatives, because for some people it's they feel empowered. The more they prepare the elevator pitch, the more empowered they feel, so they over invest into such initiatives. So the one way you could benefit from this would be to differentiate yourself, spend your time on what on probably with a more down-to-earth example, again, pitching it with 15 seconds with the 3 key highlights from your career, and then maybe spending your time finding the best failure story, So with these type of things, because interviews tend to trend from the general questions that tell me about yourself, why this company, one of the projects, to the more behavioral style of interviews, right? So failure stories are more common now than they used to 5 years ago, because behavioral interviews have become more popular since. So the better your answers for a behavioral question become, the better your chances to differentiate yourself from other candidates and, of course, reach your desired outcomes. So this would be my top 10 list with interesting questions to prepare for 2024. I hope you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.